Welcome to the fifth in a series of lectures this year on the general topic of religious experience. The series is part of a research project in the Center for the Study of Religion and Psychology at the Danielsen Institute at Boston University, funded by the Meta-Nexus Institute, which is supported by the John Templeton Foundation. My name is Robert Neville, and I'm the Executive Director of the Danielsen Institute and the Principal Investigator for this funded project. A guest lecture was given in January by Professor J. Shulkin of Georgetown University on the topic of religious quests as an experimental state of mind. The main part of the lecture series, however, consists of 6 serial lectures on the topic Religious Experience from the Mundane to the Anomalous by Professor Wesley J. Wildman of Boston University. This evening is the 4th in Professor Wildman's series. The 5th will take place on March 17th here in the colloquium room on the 9th floor of the Photonics building on the Boston University campus. Dr. Wildman is Associate Professor in the Philosophy, Theology, and Ethics Department of the Boston University School of Theology, where, among other things, he directs the doctoral program in Science, Philosophy, and Religion. He took a bachelor's degree with first-class honors in mathematics at Flinders University and a graduate degree in divinity from the University of Sydney, both in Australia. He completed a PhD in philosophical theology, systematic theology, and philosophy of religion from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. Since coming to Boston University in 1993, he has published a large book, Fidelity with Plausibility, and edited with Mark Richardson a collection of state-of-the-art debates on issues in religion and science. He was also co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Religion and Science. He's published over 60 articles in theology, ethics, and religion and science, many of which have come out of collaborative group projects, such as those of the Vatican Observatory Group and the Boston University Comparative Religious Ideas Project. Currently, he has 7 volumes in various stages of preparation and publication. Religious experience is a topic on which Professor Wildman has researched, taught, and written for the last decade or more. Please join me in welcoming him to deliver this evening's lecture entitled, Can You Trust Your Instinct? Cognitive Reliability and an Ecological Semiotic Theory of Religious Engagement. Professor Wildman.
Hello, friends. Nice to see most of you again. Well, this is the 4th lecture in the series. Just as Bob said, this is a complicated lecture. It's the most philosophical of the lectures. I also believe it's possibly the truest of the lectures. So I hope it will reward your attention. Most people rely on their experiences to authorize their beliefs, including their religious and anti-religious beliefs. In fact, such reliance is so instinctive and pervasive that we are apt to overlook it. And that makes us likely to underestimate the degree to which existentially loaded and socially potent experiences inspire those fundamental beliefs and ways of thinking that orient our lives and guide our behaviour. The question under discussion in this issue is in this lecture is whether we can trust our religious experience-based instincts. You can trust yours perhaps, but can I trust mine? What reasons do we have to accept or reject the beliefs to which the cognitive elements of religious and spiritual experiences give rise? In an era where a lot of people take for granted phenomena such as self-deception and brainwashing, groupthink and the manipulation of beliefs and behaviours by the mass media, the question of the cognitive reliability of religious and spiritual experiences is an especially pressing one. This is why many philosophers of religion in recent decades have attempted to evaluate the cognitive value of these experiences. Now, we should pause at the outset to explain a few key terms, particularly cognition and reliability. Cognition refers to all of the processes that pertain to knowledge and information processing in animals, including human beings. This involves perception and memory, reasoning and imagination, as well as knowledge and the ever-present belief. Reliability in this context refers to all of these cognitive processes in the relevant respects. This lecture will focus mostly on the reliability of beliefs that are induced or influenced by religious or spiritual experiences. The reliability question asks whether those beliefs tend to be true. To the extent that those experiences produce true beliefs, we judge the experiences themselves to be cognitively reliable. To the extent that these experiences produce false beliefs, we think of the experiences as cognitively unreliable. These are tendencies. We need to keep in mind that the distinction between true and false in a domain of symbolic religious discourse is often far from clear. It's also important to remember that aspects of human life traditionally regarded as non-cognitive, such as emotions and behaviours, mental stability and physical health, can also be induced or influenced by religious and spiritual experiences, and they're also subject to judgments of success. In this case, the reliability of these experiences is assessed with reference to their tendency to produce goodness or beauty in individual actions and cultural products, an optimal function in mind and body. Finally, the norms governing success, goodness, beauty, truth, health and optimal function, they're fabulously controverted ideas and themselves in need of an account specifically in relation to the effects of religious and spiritual experiences. These questions lie largely beyond reach in this lecture, but we'll have to remain alert to the way they show up in the unfolding argument. Now, there are three standard answers to the question of cognitive reliability. They are extreme answers and they're easy to dismiss. They are also very popular, so we need to deal with them. First, it is sometimes argued that religious and spiritual experiences have no significant cognitive element. They're not about knowing things. Thus, the question of their cognitive reliability does not or should not arise. This is famously evident in the logical positivists' treatment of religion in the early 20th century. Alfred Jules Ayer would be probably the most famous representative of that group. But like a movie star speaking out on international relations, this argument captured much more attention than it actually won agreement. In fact, the logical positivist program failed to justify its own conceptual foundations, and so all of its strict rules failed too. Second, a relatively common religious point of view is that religious cognitions are straightforwardly reliable. In such approaches, a religious experience of God communicating with a believer reliably produces true beliefs that God exists, that God communicates, and that God has intentions and thoughts and feelings and whatever other characteristics are manifested in the experience. The problem here is painfully obvious. Such beliefs seem incorrigible to those on the inside of a group, absolutely certain and beyond question. The group supports them, and yet outside the group, the beliefs seem corrigible to an extreme degree. They seem fantastic and clearly mistaken. The religious person who believes God is a communicative being because of formative religious experiences must somehow remain unaware or else delegitimate or even demonize the vast throngs of non-theistic religious people, as well as the many theists who do not think of God in those personal terms. A third extreme view holds that religious cognitions are irreparably deceptive. Proponents of this view, such as Richard Dawkins, assert that there is no rational reason to believe that religious and spiritual experiences reliably produce anything accurate. Not accurate perceptions, not true beliefs, not sound judgments, and not responsible behaviour. On the contrary, rational consideration of the evidence points in the opposite direction. And the result is that preserving psychological health and indeed protecting the security of the human future demands a wholehearted attack on religion. I have discussed this view in earlier lectures and will not repeat either the aspects of my sympathy for it or the reasons to reject it that I've already mentioned, but I will pause to add a new reason to reject it, namely that it seems to express a somewhat timid and controlling approach to life. It exchanges the blessed rage and volatile colour of vivid experiences for the white-knuckled grip and blanched face visage of desperate control. Vivid religious experiences are actually pretty common in human life. They can be disturbing, they can produce dangerously fanatical beliefs and behaviours, and they can be bent to rationalise bad behaviour. But it seems to be a case of overkill to rule all of them out, and non-vivid experiences along with them as entirely unproductive of accurate or useful or fruitful cognitions. It's better to look and see with a looser grip and a genuine appreciation for the colourful and even bizarre aspects of human life. So that's 3 extreme views tossed overboard. Once that's happened, we know that the reliability question is going to be located, like all interesting philosophical questions, in the messy mental midlands, where epistemological judgments are perpetually difficult and ontological inferences even more so. In this territory, interpreting the cognitive import of religious and spiritual experiences requires refined judgment. The associated wisdom is hard won in human life because it requires groups to achieve discerning consensus, wisdom traditions to guide those discerning groups, and the cultivation of intellectual and moral insight at every level of intellectual and social life. Reflecting these points, 4 other answers to the reliability question have repeatedly surfaced in the world's religious traditions. Each involves drawing a distinction that is supposed to help explain why some religious cognitions are accurate while others are not. So we're not doing a wholesale affirmation or a wholesale rejection now. We're trying to draw distinctions. The first distinction stipulates that some types of experience reliably produce accurate religious cognitions, while other types of experience do not. The principal discriminating factor in this case is typically the causal context of the experience. Religious and spiritual experiences occurring within and governed by an established wisdom tradition are usually taken to be reliable, at least by insiders, whereas others are not. Unfortunately, the epistemological value of such distinctions is swamped by the role they play in legitimating and authorising in-group identities and persecuting outgroups who are different. A second approach distinguishes between what types of people who can experience reliable religious cognitions and the types who cannot. The principal discriminating factor in this case is typically the cognitive apparatus or spiritual status of the person undergoing the experience. For example, some people may be farther along in a supposed samsaric cycle of lives and thus objectively capable of experience that others cannot achieve because of their relative spiritual immaturity. Again, some supposedly saintly people may be blessed with innate spiritual gifts for religious and spiritual experiences, while others simply lack the aptitudes. And some people may have brains that make for hazardous and unreliable forms of religious and spiritual experiences. Perhaps they're vulnerable to private hallucinations or bizarre beliefs or erratic behaviour. The indebtedness of the distinction to ontological frameworks makes it difficult to deploy in public discussion of cognitive reliability. For example, we cannot expect ourselves to settle debates over the reality of supposed transmigration or the alleged reality of spiritual personality types before we take up the reliability question. That would be to put the ontological horse before the practical cart, which is actually, I suppose, the wrong way to say it. We'd be putting the ontological cart before the practical horse. Thank you so much for smiling. A third approach asserts a distinction between types of interpretation of the cognitive content of religious and spiritual experiences. The principal discriminating factor in this case is typically related to richness of experience and degree of awareness. This approach harmonises with the obvious fact that human individuals and groups can learn how to refine their judgment. We can learn. At one point in their lives, they may take a profound religious experience to mean that God wants them to kill abortion clinic workers or become suicide bombers on behalf of an overridingly valuable cause. If they survive these dangerous adventures in interpreting their religious cognitions, they may later come to conclude that these beliefs derived from their profound religious experiences were somehow mistaken or distorted, perhaps because they did not have in place checks on enthusiastic interpretation that they have since implemented. In other words, they learned and improved their interpretive skills. But note that knowing that we can move in the direction of more effective interpretation does not settle the question of whether truly accurate interpretation is ever possible. A final approach proposes a pragmatic distinction based on the effects of religious cognitions. On this view, religious and spiritual experiences are cognitively reliable to the extent that they inspire religious cognitions, beliefs, imaginative symbols, acts of reasoning, with good and true and beautiful outcomes. For example, someone may experience such a flood of compassion in meditation that they become convinced that reality is ultimately pervaded with compassion, and subsequently give themselves in compassion to family, friends, neighbours, enemies and strangers as a religious act of harmonising themselves with the way they believe ultimate reality to be. This approach expresses an unimpeachable criterion for the value of religious and spiritual experiences, but it is far from being a sufficient condition for the truth of the underlying beliefs. The fact of religious pluralism shows this. Religious traditions produce numerous people with an unusually strong commitment to compassionate behaviours, but these people are diverse in the extreme with regard to their religious beliefs and their worldview level motivations for those beliefs. So I have now argued that three extreme answers to the question about cognitive reliability of these experiences are mistaken. And I've also argued that the four moderate answers are either useless or only partially useful. So we cannot settle the reliability question in these ways. All of them are short-circuited. However, many have tried. Some of these short-circuited answers may prove satisfying in religious or anti-religious communities whose identity depends on a clear-cut answer to the reliability question, positively or negatively, and it won't take much experience on your part to know that this is very common. But a wider perspective quickly manifests their evidential and conceptual defects. It appears that the reliability question will not be easily answered. And at this point, I owe you an apology. But there's nothing wrong with the lecture. And there's nothing wrong with my mind. The problem is with the topic. This is an exquisitely complex philosophical issue. The literature around it is routinely short-circuited, and when it's not, it's so complicated that most people can't fight their way through it. Which means that you're being exposed to something which is mind-numbingly complicated, and I've tried to make it as simple as I can, but I promise you that all of the deficiencies in the remainder of this lecture derive exclusively from the subject matter and not from your lecturer. Now, once we are aware that something important is at stake in the reliability question and that plenty of people stand ready to embrace short-circuited answers to it, we are led to be as clear as we can about the kinds of considerations that ought to figure into a more satisfactory answer. What are we looking for? On the basis of the discussion to this point, I think that we're looking for 6 criteria. First, we have to take proper account of the immediacy of religious and spiritual experiences. This means that the object of the experience, whether it's Allah or a bodhisattva or an angel, seems built into the experience itself. It is impossible to imagine that the experience could have been of anything else. It's cognitively loaded. Second, we have to take proper account of the conceptually mediated quality of all religious and spiritual experiences, because we experience in ways that reflect our cultural and religious formation. Third, we have to take account of the fact that formation of beliefs is culturally and socially traditioned. This is a level higher than conceptual conditioning. Fourth, we have to pay attention to rational coherence between the beliefs prompted by religious and spiritual experiences on the one hand, and the beliefs that we arrive at through the most disciplined rational reflection on the other. Fifth, we have to take account of the fact that the cognitive content of religious and spiritual experiences is richly symbolic. Among analytical philosophers of religion, this point is routinely neglected, which produces almost incomprehensibly irrelevant material. 6, and finally, we have to do justice to the value-laden quality of religious and spiritual experiences. Honouring these 6 criteria is the way to avoid the short-circuited answers criticised above. Those 6 criteria are quite demanding. Now, I think it is safe to say that the most compelling philosophical attempts to mount a case for the cognitive reliability of religious and spiritual experiences have revolved around an analogy with sense perception. The basic instinct here is sound, namely, that the cognitive immediacy of religious and spiritual experiences seems remarkably similar to the cognitive immediacy of sense experience. The perception approach has many versions, from so-called spiritual senses of mystical traditions and medieval theologians, to the spiritual capacities of faculty psychologies, and from the religious a priori approaches of Friedrich Schleiermacher and Rudolf Otto and Paul Tillich, to the dualist divine mind talking to the human mind, direct communication approach. In contemporary philosophical forays into the reliability question, the perception approach has often been deployed as an answer to skeptics who say that human cognitive apparati are ill-equipped to form true beliefs on the basis of these religious and spiritual experiences. The most notable effort in this apologetic direction is William Alston's Perceiving God from 1991, a groundbreaking and very famous work in this area. I shall refer to it here and there in what follows, though I don't have time to present my analysis of his argument. Here, the fundamental move in all apologetic deployments of the perception analogy is a pretty common sense one. Sense perception is generally reliable, so if religious perception is like sense perception in the relevant aspects, then religious perception will be similarly reliable. It's not a bad angle, worth looking into. With Alston, I do not think that the perception analogy can furnish a simple answer to the reliability question. Indeed, and this is another thing I'm sorry for, I think no approach can answer the reliability question in its full generality. Now, at this point you may feel as though you want your money back and you just want to leave. But I believe the problem is complex enough that that's the reason why we can't give a definitive answer to it. All definitive answers are short-circuited. Nevertheless, using sense perception to interpret and assess the cognitive characteristics of religious and spiritual experiences is a promising strategy for answering as much of the reliability question as turns out to be tractable. In what follows, I shall make extensive use of the connection between sense perception and religious perception as 2 instances of the same physiological hermeneutical process of a dynamic engagement with reality. All right, that will serve as a big chunk of the lecture which sets things up. Now I want to actually present an ecological semiotic theory of dynamic engagement. That is a mouthful. I promise I'll explain all the pieces, and if I don't, you can throw cookies at me afterwards. Perception is not about things appearing to us out of nowhere or somewhere, after which we just need to decide which perceptual objects are real and which are hallucinations. It is about dynamic engagement with an environment in which we learn to navigate its physicality with our embodiment and to register its value structures with our aesthetic sensitivities. We know sense perception goes wrong from time to time, so we're always trying things out. We're on the lookout for errors. We're capitalising on feedback from our exploratory efforts, and we're seeking the kind of ecological mastery that allows us to navigate our physical and social surroundings effortlessly, and at times perhaps even stylishly. Everything we know about the neurology of human cognition suggests that religious cognitions are forged in and through the same processes that produce ordinary sense-perceptual cognitions. On a supernaturalistic cosmology, with supernatural beings and gods, the ecological factors in religious and spiritual experiences become the media for cognitive content that derives ultimately from, or at least refers to, one or another of these supernatural beings, such as a personal God. But on a naturalist cosmology, the encounter with ultimacy occurs not out there, but in here, in the value-infused depth structures of the ecology of perception itself. In either case, the ecology of perception is the same, and our various belief-forming practices differ simply by virtue of their different perceptual inputs and cognitive outputs. Experience things perceptually, form beliefs, right? In, out. In the final section of this lecture, I'm going to argue that we are justified in rating the reliability of certain religious cognitions most highly in the presence of a naturalistic cosmology in which we engage ultimacy symbolically through referring to the depth structures manifested in the ecology of perception. It's a mouthful. I hope it will become clear. Thus, I shall speak of an ecological semiotic theory of dynamic engagement, where semiotic refers to the necessarily symbolic modes of interpretation that we must deploy to figure out ultimacy. I shall also argue that the reliability argument quickly collapses when we give up any one of these three components: a naturalistic cosmology, an ecological semiotic account of perception as dynamic engagement, or a symbolic account of religious cognitions. So that's the last section, but in this section, I shall discuss these three components and describe how they fit together. So, the ecology of perception. See where we're up to in the outline? Most scientific ventures have their famous, well-funded mansions and their lesser-known, underfunded bungalows. The School of Theology knows all about that. In cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience, for several decades, the kinds of research garnering the most attention and funding have been those that analyse human cognition using the model of the digital computer. On this view, the mind's cognitive operations are programs operating in the brain's hardware, or rather, as it's come to be called, its wetware. And programs for cognitive activities are portable in principle. They can be logically distinguished from any particular hardware implementation. So this outlook gave birth to artificial intelligence. The strongest versions of AI asked programmers to attempt to model human cognitive operations by implementing the same programs that were in the human brain, only in silicon hardware. The strong AI program has widely been judged a failure, which is not terribly surprising because the human brain does not act like a digital computer, as different kinds of circuitry, and its programming appears not to be logically distinguishable from its embodied platform after all. Nevertheless, the digital computer continues to be the governing metaphor for human cognition, information processing. You hear these phrases all the time. From perception to memory, from reasoning to belief, this is a kind of afterglow effect from the heyday of strong AI research. In recent times, a more balanced view has been reasserting itself with enormous power and with empirical credentials that are far more robust than those of research programs enthralled to the digital computer metaphor. This more balanced view takes mathematical and computer modelling with complete seriousness, but in place of cognitive programs that can be logically separated from their hardware platforms, this alternative view stresses the embodiment of human cognitive activities in the ecological setting for human cognition. This ecological form of cognitive psychology reclaims older insights about human cognition that fell out of favour after the arrival of digital computer technology, and it combines those insights with newfound empirical precision and neurological insight. This new approach has had a decisive impact on AI research and robotics because it shows how to think about the interaction between an entity, like an organism or a robot, with its changing dynamic environment. Can't program in the environment, so it has to be able to interact, just like us. The root ideas of an ecological theory of perception are already present in the work of psychologist James Gibson. He conceived perception as an essentially exploratory and hypothetical system by which organisms interact with and manipulate their surrounding environment. The organism samples the environment for information about interactive possibilities, and Gibson intriguingly and aptly calls them affordances. The environment affords a way of interacting with it, right? This means both that the environment is perceived according to the organism's interests and that the organism's action possibilities within its environment are disclosed according to both the way the organism is prepared to interact and the way it actually behaves in its surroundings. Very dynamic situation. If a hypothetical exploratory move in relation to an object or circumstance yields no affordances, no way to manipulate it, no way to navigate it, no way to comprehend it, no way to appreciate it, then that interactive behaviour is frustrated, and the hypothesis it expresses may be abandoned in favour of an alternative. Experience and memory, as well as observational and interpretative skills, determine how efficient the production of workable hypotheses is. I know exactly how many steps there are all throughout my house in all of the staircases because I constantly need to move around in the dark so as not to wake up my son, who's very sensitive to light, even under the crack of his door. So you can remember things and learn things and able to navigate a complicated and potentially dangerous environment if you have the right experiences. Smart mice learn the most useful way to behave and thereby tame their environment the most quickly. The role of the relevant kinds of intelligence is the same for human beings. Cooperation helps here, as the creative contributions of many communicating and mimicking organisms are more likely to unlock the environment's affordances. I can mimic you, I can copy you, I can show you how to do something. The exploratory perceptual interaction within an environment is the means by which human beings both perceive and act, and thus also the means by which they gain understanding of every kind. The encounter with a world that possesses an affordance profile, you get that phrase, an affordance profile, reflects organism interests and social organisation, and also determines accuracy and fidelity of perception and understanding. To reach out for the handle on a photorealistic painting of a door fails to yield an affordance that matches organism interest, and this in turn refines perception, modifies action, and rectifies understanding. It may even cause us to appreciate the painting out of surprise. And all of this can be as intensely emotional as it is thoroughly embodied. Our exploratory hypothetical interactions with the ambient environment thus have the structure of a dynamic dialectic between perception and action, a dialectic with bodily form and emotional texture. This ecological approach has not taken the field of perception and action psychology as a whole by storm, such is the lingering power of the digital computer metaphor, but the ecological viewpoint is gaining ground quickly. In fact, a number of cognitive psychologists have been trying to foment a revolution whose purpose is to reclaim cognition for this more balanced ecological viewpoint. The general perspective of embodied perception and an appreciation for the mutually constraining relation between action and perception is a dominant theme of contemporary perception psychology, albeit in less metaphysically modulated terminology than either Gibson or ecological psychology as a whole is inclined to use. So it hasn't taken the place by storm, but you'd have to say it's becoming dominant, slowly but surely. In fact, the Gibsonian history of this view and its earlier history in the psychology of William James and the early American pragmatists, as well as its later history in contemporary pragmatist philosophers, is often unknown to working cognitive psychologists. Such is the degree to which its fundamental outlook has been absorbed into the discipline. In the sciences, when something is absorbed, you forget where it came from because it proves so useful you don't need to study its history anymore. You only study the history of things that are fundamentally mistaken or useless. A caricature, but I think perhaps at least half fair. The ecological framework has also become central in cognitive psychology and in the neurological study of perception, and not just there, in AI research. This ecological framework serves as the new guide for robotic modelling. Think of the robotic vacuum cleaner navigating that unpredictable environment. You've seen them? Maybe you have one. They're no good if you have lots of clothes on the floor, typically. You have to pick up. Moreover, ecological psychology has had a vital impact on artifact design, software interface design, architecture, and other fields that focus either on design or on usability. In all, the ecological theory of perception and action has proved to be an empirically robust corrective to more abstracted and less embodied theories of perception and action. So that's pretty good. We should pay attention to it then, I reckon. Okay, the ecology of value. Scientific work operates at many levels simultaneously, but often clumsily, so that one level does not appreciate another. The predictable result is complaints of reductionism. Now, I'm talking about between sciences here. The humanists complain as well, but we'll get to them later. Thus, ecological psychologists from Gibson onwards decry behaviourists for reducing cognition to input-output analyses of behaviour, while treating mind as a black box that is irrelevant for understanding cognition. Ecological psychologists also complain about cognitivists for selling out to the AI program and reducing everything to information processing that is logically independent of embodiment and environment. But ecological psychologists are vulnerable to their own form of reductionism, namely that they too rarely pay attention to the way that value is encountered in the environment and appreciated in the sensing organism. That is, they are inclined to fall prey to their own form of information processing reductionism, only with a far more generous construal of the relevant environment and organism factors. Experts working on aesthetics or on the emergence of moral or religious beliefs will naturally complain, maybe bitterly complain, that the ecological framework should properly account for the emergence of value in human affairs and in the environment with which human beings interact. And indeed, the ecological theory of perception can support this. It just needs to be turned to the task. Theories of perception focused on value tend to be highly philosophical in character, and they certainly are rarer than they should be. There's the author of one of them in the room here with us today. But it turns out that the ecological framework is amenable to value categories and well suited to giving an account of the encounter with, the appreciation of, and the arising of beliefs about values of every kind, from aesthetic to moral to religious. Now, to gain some appreciation of how this works, consider a simple example. An example? Oh, that's great. An example, that's wonderful. Let's have an example. I have a friend who loves cars. Let's call him Errol. Errol reads magazines about cars. He likes to study cars. He takes his car purchases very seriously and he loves caring for his cars. He still installs his tyres with white walls facing out, though he has to fight his mechanics to do that every time because it is supposedly unfashionable. A few years ago, Chrysler introduced a retro-styled wagon called the PT Cruiser. It immediately captured Errol's attention. When Errol saw the PT Cruiser, he had feelings that I did not have, and he perceived lines and shapes in a different way than I did. I haven't asked him about this, but I imagine that he readily imagined himself driving around in the roomy little car, happily waving at other PT Cruiser owners, feeling content and at home within something like a blast from the past community of like-minded souls that no one else understood. That is, the PT Cruiser shows up for him not merely as an object that can be climbed into and driven, but also as an object with special meanings that can impact his life in ways that go well beyond the fact that it is a means of transportation. Its affordance profile in Errol's perception ecology is not merely about door handles and steering wheels and engine controls and the positioning of mirrors, but also about shapes and feelings and old memories and the evolving of a personal identity. Errol's love of cars and the associated training of his imagination is a key factor in opening up this particular world of value-laden affordances, because he has spent a long time studying lines and grills and thereby has cultivated a sophisticated taste, or at least he thinks so, for design novelty and interest. His personal history probably plays a role too, as it equips him with certain longings that the PT Cruiser unexpectedly satisfies. All this is part of his perceptual encounter with the vehicle. The point here is that perception is not just about deciding what is real and what is imagined, and it's not just about successfully navigating a world of objects, as it is in the simplest version of ecological psychology's model of perception. It's also about a dialectic of values encountered in the environment and values imposed on the environment that is every bit as important in human life as the dialectic between perception and action. It is a mistake to imagine these two levels of ecological exploration as utterly distinct, the physical navigation and the value encountering and appreciation. Our exploration of an unknown physical object is guided by past experience and current interests, as well as the object's geometry and features, which are value-laden things all. The combination is what produces affordances. As we study and feel about an object, it is much our emotions and our values as anything else that determines how we explore and what will show up for us as we do so. For example, we feel frustrated and give up, or we are intrigued and remain mystified, or it doesn't occur to us to smash the object on the ground because it seems somehow impolite to do so. I recall trying out for a job in a supermarket as a wiry young teenager. There were about a dozen kids at the interview, and at one point we were shown a very large 4 cubic foot box, which is to say 4 by 4 by 4, so really 64 cubic feet. It had a rope tied around it, like a Christmas present, and then we were asked to lift it from the top part of the rope. Now, I was first up, so I had nobody to mimic, which is tragic on this occasion. So everyone studied me carefully as I tried to find the trick that I was sure must be there, the affordance that comported with my value-driven expectation that people should avoid attempting to pick up large and awkward objects while off balance, particularly if they worked in a supermarket that has to be on the alert for job-related injuries. So I thought this was a trap, basically. Value-laden approach. So I poked around for a minute until the interviewer told me just to grab the thing and lift it. Unfortunately for me, the test was intended to evaluate the ability to lift a large and awkward object while off balance as a sign of strength, not to evaluate how to avoid having to do that as a sign of safety-mindedness. Now, nobody needs a philosopher working in a supermarket. Our awareness of value is an essential component in navigating even the physical environment. In some situations, perception seems all about values and very little about navigating a physical environment. For example, people familiar with the social conventions and purpose of an art museum know that an oil painting in a frame on the wall should not be touched out of respect for the painting and for the sake of its safety and preservation. Rather, it should be observed and appreciated from a distance. The physical challenges thus negotiated, hopefully without any docent reprimands. Everything subsequently about the act of perception relates to aesthetic appreciation. This is very much a dynamic and dialectical process, as in the example of Errol's P.T. Cruiser. There are values encountered in the painting and values brought to the appreciation of the painting. Traditions play a role in structuring and liberating those values in both perceiving subject and perceived object. In all such encounters, but especially in those where aesthetic sophistication is present, the dance of values is enormously complex and rewarding, with powerful emotional colourings. These might trigger strong impulses towards bodily movements, such as dancing or weeping, but those normally would be suppressed out of deference to social norms governing museum behaviour. All right, so now the ecology of semiosis, the ecology of signs and symbols. This ambient environment I've been talking about is physically complex and laden with values, which is to say that it is ready to be perceived this way by organisms possessing appropriate cognitive faculties, interests, preparation, and opportunities. Some of these values are so complex and dense with significance that we cannot easily describe them. Fortunately, we can express meanings and values indirectly, stimulating the imaginations of others in directed ways toward a shared appreciation of that which we perceive. Even when we cannot name or describe without misleading, we can still create shared understanding of the values that we engage as we live in our complex environments. Errol may not be able to say quite what it is about the PT Cruiser that just makes him feel so content, but he can sweep his hand along the curves of the car's profile to indicate something indirectly. And he does. Or he can show a photograph of the cars he used to drive as a younger man, wordlessly almost. Look at this, right? See how that works? Expressing the values engaged in a museum encounter with an excellent oil painting is made easier with the technical languages of art history and art criticism. But even in the absence of such specialised languages, we can use analogies and metaphors to describe how we respond to the painting and what it is we think we see in it. Our entanglement in symbolism is not merely a kind of cognitive last resort, an expression of the failure of imagination and intelligence that should be eliminated as quickly as possible by carefully translating indirect and non-literal forms of discourse into direct and literal ways of speaking. No, that kind of literal translation, in fact, is rarely within our grasp. This is true even in beholding a painting or the curve of a car. But the role of symbols in religious perception is even more central than in these examples of complex aesthetic encounters. Religious objects are, at least sometimes, beyond expression in a more or less definitive way. Symbolic discourse is absolutely unavoidable in such cases. Preparing to perceive religious objects requires symbolism. Forming beliefs based on religious perception requires symbolism. Expressing those beliefs requires symbolism. And forging shared understanding through language and practices requires symbolism. Symbolic modes of understanding and communication are not optional frills on the sturdy dress of perception. We know this just from introspection to some degree, but the architecture of the brain expresses it also. For example, the cortex uses categorizations that allow one thing to stand for others. And in the process of cognitive and specifically perceptual integration, information-rich pathways are simplified and represented using these categorizations. The way we interact with our ambient environment in perception is thus already imbued with symbolic forms of thought, from categorical representations to root metaphors that govern and guide our understanding. These symbolic cognitive resources are essential for making sense of a world that otherwise remains a perpetual mystery to us, and potentially a dangerous one at that. Symbolic cognitive resources are particularly important for engaging the subtler aspects of reality that may not be registered in the experience of cognitively simpler organisms. We are, as Terence Deacon so aptly expressed it, the symbolic species. Now, from epistemology to ontology, the emergence of self and world. The understanding of perception that I've been sketching satisfies the immediacy criterion, but not in a way that implies direct realism. You can't just read off of those experiences that that's the thing that's out there. It's way too complex. It's symbolically laced, it's value-laden, it might not even be there. In fact, a phenomenologically sensitive account of the emergence of self and world from the symbolically and conceptually mediated interaction of organism and environment problematizes the claim of direct realism. So in rounding out this presentation of an ecological semiotic theory of dynamic engagement, we need to consider the move from epistemology to ontology, from the way we know to the way things are. It's crucial for assessing the reliability of things, wouldn't you say? It's one thing to know stuff, but if you don't know what's going on out there, then how do you know it's reliable? What does that even mean? We need to have a handle on this move from the way we know to the way things are. The ecological psychology of cognition that I've been presenting is unusually faithful to the actual elements of our experiences of learning, navigating, understanding, acting, and appreciating. Once we can get some distance on our ordinary ways of thinking about what is real and try to cleave to our basic experiences, we quickly notice something, that our impression of the real is a socially cooperative endeavour built on the perception-action dialectic in engagement with an ambient environment. It opens up to our understanding only in the respects that we're prepared to engage it. Where direct realism takes for granted from the outset a sharp border between perceiving subject and perceived object, the more empirically scrupulous way to proceed is to pay attention to the way this borderline emerges from our experience and remains to some degree hazy. Now, to the extent that I attempt to discern the subject-object border in some situations, well, let's say in relation to the experience of unsuccessfully navigating that part of my dark house that is responsible for my stubbing my toe, I can speak with some confidence of a sharp distinction between the I, the subject feeling pain, and the wall-like object that appears not to be suffering even a little bit. The more we attend to the value dimensions of our experience, however, the more blurred the subject-object borderline becomes. What is a mere scrawling of chalk to one person can be an extraordinarily beautiful equation from quantum chemistry to another. And what is a solid, opaque, rocky mass to the person who accidentally kicks a wall is to the quantum chemist a mostly empty configuration of matter energy whose interacting components are described by that chalk equation. The boundary is even more blurred in personal relationships, where our projections govern much of our behaviour regardless of the degree to which more careful attention would force the correction of those projected representations of other people. It is possible for direct realism to reassert itself. Direct realists can say that the world is what it is and we are what we are, and our cognitive interactions with the world are imperfect and shot through with errors small and large, and that as we learn we discover that direct realism was correct after all. But that's only compelling in relation to the sheer physicality of subject-object distinctions when they apply. As we learn about the value-laden dimensions of reality, we discover precisely the opposite of what direct realism suggests we should. That is, we learn that the issues that are most important to us, such as aesthetic experiences, social harmony, spiritual fulfillment, intimate relationships, call for all kinds of mergers of self and other that positively require hazy lines between subject and object. I'm not talking about bodies here, right? I'm talking about the emergence of subject and object from experience. Bodies is a judgment we make later. That's the physicality of things. This is not a mere metaphorical way of speaking, therefore, except to the direct realist and the materialist who just hates talking about values. It is simply taking with complete seriousness and with proper attention our experiences of navigating the value-laden dimensions of reality. The distinction between subject and object is an experiential phenomenon for which we need a sophisticated cognitive apparatus. Presumably animals have this capacity to a significant degree. But collapsing the distinction between subject and object in the name of exploring our value-laden ambient environment and creatively forging new experiential possibilities requires even more cognitive sophistication. Only human beings, as far as we know at this point, have cognitive power sufficient for that task. Now, how does this impact the all-important journey from epistemology to ontology? In the dynamic engagement model of perception, the basic posture is that we form beliefs tentatively and act on them experimentally, as though reaching our hand into a dark corner to discover what is there. This is all very exhausting and anxiety-producing. Fortunately, habits of experience simplify our engagement with the world and equip us with a host of working beliefs about the world that serve us well. When they don't serve us well, as happens often enough, we make adjustments. In this way, the ontological landscape of our experience emerges. It's not given a priori or by fiat, it emerges from the mist of sense experience. We only have a hypothetical cognitive map of that landscape, naturally, and we adjust the map as needed, which we do easily and without even noticing the subtle adjustments, or with great difficulty and enormous emotional resistance, depending on how disruptive the change would be to our typically comfortable and efficient way of thinking about the things in the world. Many parts of that cognitive map of ontological realities are universally shared. These are the bits we tend to call physical reality, though they also include the basic problems that all human cultures have had to solve. Other parts are culturally specific, as we discover when we travel. This is particularly true of values governing social interactions, for example. Still other parts are specific to religious outlook, as we discover when we encounter those whose religious beliefs differ from our own. And yet other parts of our working ontological maps are even more idiosyncratic and perhaps completely private, as a child believes in a personal friend, invisible to everyone else. In general, the more value laid in the object of our engagement, the more symbolic our mode of registering it, the more group-specific the beliefs that express it, and the more likely it is to matter to us existentially. All right, now the last section, reliability. At this point, we've done enough conceptual work to address the question of interest in this lecture, the cognitive reliability of religious and spiritual experiences. The failure of comprehensive shortcut answers shows us that we will have to resign ourselves to answering only parts of the reliability question. As Alston discovered during his many years of reflecting on the reliability question, the parts we can answer most securely aren't really about the first order reliability question at all. They're about the degree to which we are rationally entitled to treat our religious and spiritual experiences as cognitively reliable. See the difference? It's not about whether those experiences are reliable, it's whether we're entitled to assume that they are. Second order kind of question. We can mount arguments about that. Arguments about first order reliability, particularly around religious issues, very complex. Well, it may seem strange to discuss rational entitlement to assume an answer to that reliability question instead of answering the reliability question itself directly. I mean, anyone would have to admit that's strange and possibly a little disappointing. But I already apologise for that. But the evidential and conceptual complexity of the first order reliability question is such that we really don't know the whole answer. We can only consider bits and pieces of it. It takes a large dose of humility for a philosopher to accept this. I wouldn't normally claim to be that humble as a philosopher, but in this case I'm trying to be true to the subject matter. And the subject matter defeats us to a significant degree. But we can still say some things. So in what follows, I'm first going to identify key assumptions that damage rational entitlement to proceed as if those experiences are cognitively reliable. Damages our ability to make that case, right? Then I argue that a certain class of religious and spiritual experiences, an evolutionarily stabilised class of experiences called intense experiences, when interpreted properly, increase our entitlement to proceed as if religious and spiritual experiences are cognitively reliable. These two bits of the reliability question are extremely important, with potentially disturbing implications for religious self-awareness, as well as reassuring implications for some. If I can make a case to show that someone's entitlement to assume that their religious and spiritual experiences is reliable is weak, I'm challenging their rational right to trust their instincts. You see that? That's disturbing. And someone taking this argument on, internally, internalising the argument, would find themselves with a kind of crisis about how to process their instincts, how to react to them. So despite the fact that it's a second order question, it's existentially vital and deeply challenging to religious people. So first of all, ways to damage rational entitlement to presume cognitive reliability. Religious and spiritual experiences, when thought of as forms of dynamic perceptual engagement, as we've been doing here, are varied in their power to consolidate confidence around ontological questions. The more the cognitive content of these experiences is contested by groups with similar standing to the one in which we participate, the less compelling are our local ontological claims. I say God exists in your little group on the same level you say God doesn't exist. That's a problem for me. I can say you're wrong. I can say you're possessed by the devil. I can say you're right but stupid. I can toss you a bone and say that I'll say that you're right even though you're not really, because I'm afraid of you or because I want you to feel good about yourself. But there's a real problem there. Rationally, there's a problem. These group-relative religious perceptions, along with their cognitive productions, will not be trusted very far by anyone with a sufficiently wide vision of the question. to the extent that they are interpreted literally, right? The literal interpretation is crucial. In fact, the arbitrariness of the ontological convictions, you say God, I say nirvana, that kind of thing, makes questionable even the existential value of the experiences. Now that's when you interpret them literally, but if you interpret them symbolically, the same group relative religious perceptions might be quite compelling, and their powerful effects in people's lives can be recognised as authentic. And surely authenticity is one kind of reliability. Such judgments of authenticity are based on the way the beliefs deriving from religious perceptions help people navigate their value-laden ambient environment successfully. They are far from straightforward because successful navigation typically requires group relative concepts, at least to some degree. We discern beauty in relation to norms that are at least influenced by culture-level considerations, for example. Ideas of physical beauty, for example, vary across cultures. Judging the truth of religious beliefs deriving from religious perceptions is even more complicated. The symbols used to express the ontological claims about reality coded in those beliefs are typically multivalent. Those symbols being multivalent makes reconciling conflicting ontological claims tricky. It's hard to figure out what they mean. If you interpret there is a God symbolically, well, does that actually conflict with ultimate reality as Brahman or emptiness or not? Who can tell? The problem defines a complex philosophical and theological task of interpretation and evaluation, and it is one governed by necessarily flexible standards, which means that it requires a kind of artistic sensibility. Comparative theologians know all about that. For example, it's possible to reconcile the ontological implications of perceptions of a personal deity with the ontological implications of perception of the Tao in the vibrant depths of natural processes when both are interpreted symbolically. But it is a meaningful reconciliation only when active schemas for interpreting those symbols allow the ontological implications of the two perceptions to be made precise. Religious and philosophical traditions and their many sub-traditions furnish such schemas that flesh out the meaning of symbols. But their implementation is a complex hermeneutical matter that shifts with time and place. Thus it is correspondingly difficult to venture judgments of the truth of religious beliefs. Of course, when the symbolic character of religious cognitions is ignored, then it's relatively easy to make a truth judgment. But then the judgment required is that at least one and probably both sets of ontological claims are incorrect. This is devastating to the impression of reliability of religious and spiritual experiences as a cognitively productive mode of perceptual engagement. Literalism is the death knell of the reliability argument. From this example, which is representative of an enormously large class of religious perceptions, we learn that neglecting the symbolic character of religious cognitions routinely has a large negative impact on cases for reliability. We also learn that when we take the symbolism criterion seriously, the reliability question is impacted probably neither negatively nor positively. It's all subject to the kinds of philosophical arguments that ensue after the ontological implications of the symbolic statements in question are unpacked. Now, something similar occurs if we surrender the ecological semiotic account of perception as dynamic engagement and revert instead to an account of perception that entails direct realism, which I tried to attack earlier. The damage done to the reliability case by literal interpretations of religious perceptions is done equally well by the ontological over-crispness of direct realism. After all, it matters little for the purposes of undermining your entitlement to believe your religious cognitions whether we have two literal and contradictory ontological claims or two clear-cut ontological situations that imply contradictory ontological claims. Either way, the cognitive faculties that supervise the journey from perception to belief are not to be trusted. So thus far we've seen that systematically ignoring the symbolic character of religious cognitions and adopting any theory of perception that entails direct realism vitiates all of the advantages of maintaining the immediate qualities of perception. It negatively impacts judgment of the cognitive reliability of religious and spiritual experiences, and thus recommends against trusting our religious perceptual instincts. There is a third factor with a similar negative impact on the reliability question, namely the operation of a supernaturalistic cosmology. In this case, the problem derives from the fact that supernaturalism defeats any and all attempts at public checking and evaluation. After all, why should a supernatural deity behave in such a way as to ease the epistemic scruples of those who anxiously cast about for public verification of supernaturalist ontological claims? Surely God has better things to do. But the removal of a vital basis for public debate and evaluation does negatively impact the reliability question, just because we are rationally justified investing great confidence in those cognitive procedures that others can check. And if no others can check it, if it's not public, our argument for reliability takes a hit. So there we have it. The case for the cognitive reliability of religious and spiritual experiences virtually collapses when we give up any one of these three components: a naturalistic cosmology, an ecological semiotic account of perception as dynamic engagement, or a symbolic account of religious cognitions. That means supernaturalists, direct realists, or inveterate literalists need not panic. In a slightly adjusted version of what Alston argues, people are rationally entitled to explore the world of religious meanings however they see fit, if they want. Why not? Based on the consequences of their perceptual experiences that may correct what they were trying to do, what they thought they saw. In other words, those supernaturalists, direct realists and literalists adopt assumptions that vitiate their rational entitlement to proceed as if religious perceptions were actually reliable. They are still rationally entitled to proceed as if their religious perceptions were possibly reliable. A weaker kind of entitlement. It's something. It's a lot less than they would want, though, I suspect. Now, enhancing rational entitlement. What factors enhance rational entitlement? The argument about the reliability question to this point has merely identified conditions under which the case for reliability is negatively affected, namely the surrendering of a naturalistic cosmology, of an ecological semiotic account of perception as dynamic engagement, or of a symbolic account of religious cognitions. But this says nothing about our rational entitlement to presume reliability within a framework that holds fast to those three conditions. That is, when religious and spiritual experiences are interpreted in terms of a naturalistic cosmology, in terms of an ecological semiotic account of perception as dynamic engagement, and in terms of a symbolic account of the resulting religious cognitions, do we have improved prospects for demonstrating their cognitive reliability, for saying I'm entitled to proceed as if they are actually reliable, subject to correction in the process of engaging the world? Do we have that or not? The answer to this question, at this point you may get very angry at me, in relation to the whole diverse tangle of religious and spiritual experiences is, I think, no. We are not entitled. To recall the phenomenological efforts of the previous lecture, those of you who are here, these experiences are too varied to possess a clear-cut cognitive profile. They must correspond to a wide variety of cognitive operations with neural expressions that are quite different, some of which have been convincingly shown to be quite unreliable, such as superstition, agency detection, and intention attribution. But at this point it's vital to recall, at last, some good news, if you're religious, that some religious and spiritual experiences are more universal in our species than others. In the previous lecture we identified a class of evolutionarily stabilised religious and spiritual experiences that are also ultimacy experiences. These are the intense experiences, where intensity is understood in a breadth and depth way as involving simultaneously strong activation with strong meanings and rich interconnectedness. In relation to this special and species-wide subset of religious and spiritual experiences, I think we can show that the case for cognitive reliability improves. We are more entitled to trust our beliefs when they spring from those kinds of experiences than we would be otherwise. Of course, we would have to presume the three conditions whose refusal damages rational entitlement. But what does the case look like? Well, at the outset, we once again need to rule out a shortcut. Just because intense experiences are evolutionarily stabilised, this is still rather hypothetical at this point despite compelling preliminary evidence, it does not mean that they are reliable. After all, it is adaptive to impute intentionality to a rustling bush and to run away, even though the wind was doing the rustling, because people lacking that intentionality attribution instinct will get eaten by lions often enough to impact the human gene pool. Tendencies to certain types of cognitive error are thus demonstrably adaptive. So adaptability is a very different issue from cognitive reliability. Having avoided this disastrous shortcut, which, sad to say, some philosophers have taken, either negatively or positively, the long way around involves situating intense experiences in relation to the three conditions that we've put in place. I'm not going to repeat them again. That phrase may be becoming nauseous. Under these three conditions, we can give a more specific interpretation of intense experiences. In a fully naturalistic framework, there are no supernatural realms, no divine beings, no discarnate entities such as demons or angels, but there is enormous richness of value in the structures and processes of nature, from heart-rending beauty to complexly ambiguous moral possibilities, from glorious mathematical patterns to staggeringly counterintuitive physical transactions. These depths of nature have important existential implications and are subject to phenomenological, existential, philosophical and theological renderings. So it's not surprising that some religious intellectuals have seen in these depths of nature the proper ontological referent for words such as God and Tao, both thought of as ground of being, with different overtones in the two contexts. This kind of value-sensitive naturalism leads directly and naturally to a religious naturalism, in a way that flattened-out value-averse types of materialism do not. Religious naturalism is a religiously and theologically potent outlook on life, and it coexists with other viewpoints within all of the world's major religious traditions. People who cannot bear the superstition-like aspects of supernatural religious beings typically appreciate one or another variation of religious naturalism, and they engage the spiritual dimension of reality on its terms. What are intense experiences in the context of naturalism? Understood in this religiously potent way, they are nothing less and nothing more than perception of the depth structures of nature in all of their intricate differentiation and grading. And I argued in the previous lecture that this involves the qualities of depth, horizon, scale, complexity, and mystery. Intense experiences are the means by which we engage the valuational richness of reality, just as sense perception is the way that we engage the sensible aspects of our ambient environments. We need an ecological semiotic account of perception as dynamic engagement to appreciate the parallels between the cognitive capacity for intense experiences and the cognitive capacity for sense perception. These are two levels of a seamless form of engagement, consisting in the interested navigation of an environment with the aid of conceptual mediation and cultural traditions, taking in whatever our cognitive apparatus permits us to absorb, powering the action-perception dialectic and responding to correction as necessary. There is enormous richness in the value structures that the capacity for intense experiences enables us to absorb. Now, this richness is often mind-boggling. Frequently it defies normal cognitive processing to the point that we suffer various kinds of aphasia as we struggle to express what we have in fact engaged. Symbolic structuring of such experiences and symbolic modes of talking about them are therefore crucial. These symbolic resources liberate us into realms of speech that are different from the literalised speech of daily life, but not even a tiny bit contrived. The culturally traditioned character of perceptual experience furnishes the schemas according to which we can give more formal philosophic expression to the beliefs that flow from intense experiences. And after that, philosophers and theologians have to worry about rational consistency. However, because the object of intense perceptual experience in a naturalistic framework is just the valuational depth structures of the same reality that we also perceive regularly through our senses, and because the cognitive apparatus in question is equally universal in relation to these intense experiences, the problem of religious pluralism does not become a spectral horror that it is when you've got one of the other kinds of approaches that we've been talking about, like a supernaturalistic approach, for example. It defeats Alston's approach. He himself knows it. Indeed, the prospects for cross-cultural consensus on the valuational depth structures of reality are quite good, and certainly infinitely better than the insurmountable problem posed by the contradictions that arise within supernaturalistic direct realism and literal belief frameworks, such as Alston's. What evolutionary sense can we make of this species-wide capacity for intense experiences? I think the most likely answer to this question at the present time is that the capacity for intense experiences is an elaboration of the ordinary cognitive processes of sense experience itself. It is directly linked to the organism's need for perception to manifest ever more intricate affordances in the environment. Thus, it was probably the capacity for intense experience was probably selected right along with sense experience, and for much the same reasons. And at worst, it was a side effect that followed close on the heels of ordinary sense perception, because it was more or less a direct elaboration of ordinary sense perception rather than a new cognitive process. It didn't require new neural networks. In either case, it was almost certainly adaptive in its original ancestral environment, because then as now it is a vital skill in settings that reward high alertness, high awareness of environment, and high sensitivity to emotional nuance, with increased survival statistics and increased reproductive opportunities. Sexy, in other words. Note that little of this is true for the full diversity of religious and spiritual experiences in general. Everything I've just said pertains only to this species-wide capacity for intense experiences. Recall that a cognitive capacity can be valuable or not valuable, and in this case, reliable or not reliable, regardless of its evolutionary origins. So then how does this evolutionary account help us evaluate the reliability of the capacity for intense experiences? The evolutionary framework serves to delimit relatively precisely the relationship between this capacity for intensity and ordinary sense perception. One's an elaboration of the other. It's an amplification and intensification. This grounds our expectation that there will be regions of high reliability and regions of malfunction in the cognitive capacity for intensity, just as these regions exist in the capacity for sense perception. And anyone in a psychotic state, afterwards anyway, will tell you that possibly that was a moment of malfunction and that their judgment was impaired at that time. The evolutionary link between intensity perception and sense perception entitles us to evaluate the cognitive elements of intensity perception in the same way that we do sense perception. We look for rational coherence in the consequences of our engagement with the environment on the terms of these modes of perception. In the context of naturalism, there's high rational coherence in the cognitive consequences of intensity perception. As I have said, that's the burden of comparative theology. Thus, our rational entitlement to presume the cognitive reliability of intense experiences is increased, so long as we maintain the three basic conditions: a naturalistic cosmology, an ecological semiotic account of perception as dynamic engagement, and a symbolic account of religious cognitions. Now, I knew this lecture was just going to be a few minutes later than my normal 65 minutes, but I have 3 paragraphs to go. None of them are long. Can you stick with me for 3 more paragraphs? Because this is the conclusion. I've argued that observing these 3 basic conditions, here we go again, a naturalistic cosmology, an ecological semiotic account of perception as dynamic engagement, a symbolic account of religious cognitions, increases rational entitlement to presume the cognitive reliability of religious and spiritual experiences, but only insofar as those experiences are intense experiences or derived directly from them. This is not all of religious and spiritual experiences by any means. Spent a long time locating intense experiences as a relatively small subset of religious and spiritual experiences. Nevertheless, it is an important and relevant subset of religious and spiritual experiences. So in concluding, we need to ask whether these 3 conditions are actually true. It's a fair question, I think. In the course of this lecture, I have argued for the second and third conditions, the ecological semiotic account of perception and the symbolic account of religious cognitions. But I have not argued for the first condition, a naturalistic cosmology. I've started to make that case in previous lectures, and I'll return to it in later lectures. For now, it's enough to note that a naturalistic cosmology, in conjunction with those other conditions, positively impacts rational entitlement to presume cognitive reliability, while a supernaturalistic cosmology negatively impacts this same entitlement. Doesn't mean anyone's wrong or anyone's right. What we're arguing about is whether or not people are entitled rationally to assert the reliability and act as if their religious perceptions are reliable. So I've argued that this need not unduly worry supernaturalists because they're still entitled to presume the possible reliability of their experiences, even though not their actual reliability. The flip side of this coin represents an intriguing and perhaps unexpected benefit of a naturalistic outlook on religious and spiritual experiences. So this lecture has answered the question about the cognitive reliability of religious and spiritual experiences at the level and to the extent possible when we resolutely refuse to revert to short-circuited approaches that arbitrarily neglect complexities. In the process, a framework for interpreting the cognitive elements of these experiences has been proposed and defended, one that takes with due seriousness the cognitive immediacy criterion, the conceptual mediation criterion, the epistemic tradition criterion, the rational coherence criterion, the symbolism criterion, and the value criterion. You should have seen all 6 of those criteria show up in the argument as we went along. And the argument has also situated religious and spiritual experiences, as well as ordinary sense perception, within an ecological theory of dynamic engagement. So that much achieved, it's also important to repeat the limitations of the argument. No general answer has been given to the question of the wholesale reliability of religious and spiritual experiences in all of their diversity. Indeed, several common answers to this larger question have been ruled out as short-circuited. Moreover, in those cases where I argued that there are strong rational grounds for presuming cognitive reliability, it was only in relation to intense experiences, not religious and spiritual experiences in general, and only when the 3 basic conditions are in place. In most other situations, the rational grounds for presuming cognitive reliability are relatively weak. This may strike some as a rather bleak conclusion, but is a genuinely exciting conclusion for the religious naturalist. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wildman. We have time for a few questions.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I wonder if you would agree to this as a restatement of...
Yes.
That's good, that's good, yeah. Now comes the qualification. Philosophers give a simple answer with many qualifications. Haven't you shown that the very issue, the question of the cognitive reliability of religious experience, even intense religious experience, for justifying belief, puts the epistemological cart before the ontological horse? Isn't it the case, from what you said in your theory of symbols and engagement, that beliefs themselves are instrumental in allowing us to have certain kinds of experiences? Now, those beliefs need to be interpreted, and we critical folks would interpret them with comparative theology, with metaphysics, and all the sorts of things that would sort out your naturalistic cosmology, your theory of symbols, and so forth.
Correct.
So then to have an experience itself, a religious experience of your intense sort, that in which you can have confidence and trust and say, aha, this is it, is achieved only through the sorting through of the beliefs and symbols.
Yes, that is correct. Therefore, it's important just to repeat one thing. When I have an intense experience which produces a belief, and I understand that belief symbolically, and I know that there exist philosophers and theologians who can help me render the rational consistency of that belief with other similar beliefs, right? I'm not concluding that the experience was reliable. I'm testing my hypothesis that I'm rationally entitled to act as if these experiences are cognitively reliable. The logical distinction there is quite important. The only way reliability pans out in this framework is over time, by trying. You just have to keep trying and testing and testing. The absolute basis for any kind of a clear-cut judgment on the question is removed in this account of perception.
I thought of a strange image as you were talking. It's not Errol's car, but...
I see you know Errol.
Yes, I remember Errol well. But it's of the old Polaroid pictures.
Yeah.
And it's as if you're saying, look, as we peel this off, it's not that you should trust what you see, but perhaps the commitment to continuing to look and wait and test is itself valuable. So it's less the validity of the particular judgments you make than a lending of the value of the pursuit.
Right.
And so it's worth opening up this kind of picture and testing, which is a grand level of invitation to consider that these are potentially reliable, even if every symbol you make must be broken. So at some level, I'm drawing an analogy to some of what Bob had written. To those people who require a foundation or a truth or something once and for all, when you say, can you trust your instincts? No, that's troublesome. But it seems to me much of what you've presented is so consonant with formation in most religious traditions.
Yep.
And so at some level, we are idol makers. We do make graven images or substitute the conditioned for the unconditional. And it seems to me you're rendering in another language truths that have been spoken in many religious traditions. Don't become attached to this, because that becomes a way of standing between you and what's real. But it doesn't, you should not then say, well, I'll give up the game entirely, or be skeptical of the project. You should pursue it, but knowing that all along the way, all the symbols that you use will be broken and subject to correction. Is that a fair way of interpreting some of
It's
what
a fair way for a lot of it, yeah. The apophatic mystics, in all traditions, they exist in all traditions, always get this stuff right. And what you're referring to when you emphasize the push towards non-attachment is front and center in all of those traditions. Now, the qualification is that all of us are in the business of exploring the ambient environment, including in its religious aspects. So all of us head out into that world hoping that the cognitive apparatuses that we're blessed with will yield reliable cognitions, true beliefs, valuable insights, and so forth. But there are more and less strong versions of that. Me being entitled to presume that that's possibly the case is much weaker than me being entitled to assume that it is actually the case. Everyone has the former. It's very difficult to get anything stronger than that. And in this lecture, what I tried to do was to tease out the precise conditions under which you can get past the weaker kind of entitlement to a stronger kind of entitlement. Now, as an apophatic, mystical theologian, philosopher myself, I know what's ultimately going to happen to all of those truths. They're all going to be denied, and attachment to all of them will be broken in the process of a sincere search for ultimacy. Nevertheless, there are measures of reliability along the way, so the distinction between these two kinds of entitlement still matters.
That's helpful, thanks.
I think we have time for one more.
I would really like to thank you. I gave you 10 more minutes today than my normal 65. Thank you for your patience.
Let me ask you a practical question then. So what advice would you give to a minister, a rabbi, a religious leader of some sort when a congregant comes reporting a very strong, very intense, and somewhat troubling experience and they're doubting, they're wondering, was this real or not?
Well, the first thing I would advise that minister or rabbi or monk or priest, whatever, is not to give that parishioner my book. After that, I think the best suggestion is to just employ the usual techniques for discernment that are in use within that tradition. There are tons of beautiful and useful traditions of discernment whereby the enthusiasms of youth are checked and the craziness of weird cognitions are balanced against the longer-term trajectories of wisdom that inhabit traditions. And so, in other words, I would advise them just to employ the standard techniques that they already use to guide religious people in a wise path.
Thank you.